Hello everybody, welcome to another video on openings, and this opening we'll be doing is the French defence, and I realise I don't really think I've done any games on the French. I haven't shown any master games and I haven't had any personal games which follow the French defence setup, so I thought I'd do this video to give an overview. The French defence starts off e4, e6, d4, d5. So this is basically the starting position of the French, and White has about four responses that are considered main line. The first of them is the simple capture. And after Black captures with the pawn, this is known as the exchange French, so called because of the exchange of pawns. And this line isn't so popular anymore. It has been played occasionally, but it's seen to be very drawish as White has surrendered the space advantage. So a possible continuation might be bishop d3, bishop d6, putting the two bishops on good squares, knight c3, c6. Black creates a pawn chain while White has the knight developed. Knight g to e2, knight f6, bishop g5. And after a move like bishop g4, you can already see the position's almost symmetrical. Small difference, but not very much of one. And White could then break the pin and Black retreats. Maybe the queen could move to d2 and bishop g6 rerouting. So this would be a fairly regular position in an exchange French. And after, say, both sides castle, I can't really see any big advantage for White, and neither can the computer, really. Black will develop with knight b to d7 and queen c7, and the e-file is the only one worth putting the rooks on, so both sides will then put the rooks on the e-file, and there's likely to be a lot of exchanges, and will probably exchange to a fairly drawn position. So after rook a e1, knight b d7, knight f4, and perhaps Black could just take the bishops on d3. So the exchange French isn't that enterprising for White, but it does give White an easy, good game, with there being ideas of putting the rooks on the e-file, and often there's some small pressure from White on the king side of the board, not so much the queen side. Going back, the other pawn move is pushing, so trying to cement the space advantage early. This is known as the advanced French, because you've advanced the pawn. Now, what happens here is that White has a small pawn chain going from d4 to e5. So Black challenges it, and the way to challenge a pawn chain is to attack the base of it. So often here White will lengthen the pawn chain and be ready to recapture on d4 with the pawn. And Black's goal is basically to keep putting pressure on the d4 square and other dark squares in general. So knight c6, knight f3, queen b6, bishop d3 can be played because there's a nice tactic here. If Black takes off everything on d4, White then has bishop b5 check with a discovered attack on Black's unprotected queen. So while Black may take, bishop b4 check is more likely to be seen. Knight c3, knight g to e7, castles, castles. And I think here this is quite a good position for both sides. Black can put the knight onto f5 or g6 at a later point. There's also the idea that's quite thematic of challenging white's pawn structure with f6 at some point in the game. But the problem I have with the French, which I have talked about in a previous video, is the bishop on c8 often has nothing to do and is pretty much trapped over on c8. The best plan is usually to play bishop d7, put a rook on the c-file, and just wait for the bishop to be able to move to b5 or c6 or a4. But it feels quite nasty to have your bishop inside the pawn chain. The bishop isn't. The pawn chain f7, e6, d5 is sealing in the bishop. So I would prefer to have the bishop on g4 or g6, somewhere more active. Anyway, that is the advanced French. Two more moves. One is knight c3, and this can lead to very sharp tactical lines with bishop b4, known as the Vinaver, and queen g4 can be played. There are less sharp lines, but queen d4 is very popular. Here, though, there's quite a nice move with king f8 or knight e7. And then after a couple of exchanges, usually this pawn structure is reached. So what the idea here is that white's pawn structure is not so good, but on the plus side, black's piece coordination isn't that good either. So it's a battle of weaknesses, really. Who's got the weakest position? And there are very sharp lines in this, which I feel it would take about 45 minutes to go through all the complexities of the Vinaver. So I may have to do another video on that. Anyway, this is a brief overview of the French. So if you want a sharp line, I would recommend the Vinaver. So other than knight c3 can also be replied with knight f6. It doesn't have to be bishop b4 that can be played. And here white can play bishop g5, threatening e5. Bishop e7 is quite common. e5, knight d7. And here white can sacrifice a pawn with h4. And after the exchanges, white has a ready-made h-file attack for the rook. And if black castles kingside, he can get slaughtered very quickly, as well as there being a couple of tempo-gaining moves such as knight f3 hitting the queen. But if white wants a more solid game, bishop takes, queen takes. f4 can be played to try and cement a good pawn structure and space advantage. c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. So this is quite a complex position here. One possible line, black can castle, but also black could challenge the bishop, and then after takes, castles, takes, bishop b7, perhaps black's bishop can make itself useful after moves such as c5 and d4, whereas black does have some weaknesses on the dark squares, though. So this would be an interesting position to play. White also has ideas of playing f5 as a later date, maybe after a move like queen e2, and then rook a to d1 or e1. So interesting double-edged nature of this position. And the more quiet move of the French, which doesn't go in for the very tactical Vinaver, is knight d2. And I used to play this myself before I stopped playing e4. And what this does is it still guards e4, so if black takes, white can take with a space advantage. But the main line of the French, which is generally quite a closed position, is again knight f6, e5, knight fd7. f4 isn't the main move. Knight f3 or knight e2 is, but I think f4 is quite challenging for black. But c5 and c3. And again, black is aiming at d4. So knight c6, knight e2, queen b6, knight b3 or f3 to guard the pawn. Takes. Because here you don't need to take with the c pawn. What you could do as an alternate plan is you could use d4 to use as a square for your knights and other pieces, because e5 is now being protected by the f4 pawn, and white could make a pawn chain going from h2 all the way to e5. So this isn't main line, but I just thought I'd give you a sort of larger range of possibilities than just making very slight variations on the same sort of ideas. So controlling d4 is an idea, but that means that black has c5 as a square to use for piece maneuvering. Bishop e3 could be played, bishop d7, and after, say, bishop e2, bishop e7, castles, we again have a very interesting game with a lot of maneuvering via the center of the board here. So again, it's all about piece play, and black's pawn structure is excellent, whereas white might be a tiny bit weaker. But again, white has a space advantage, so you have to weigh those two things in your head and decide which side you'd prefer to play here. I think I always like space advantages, even though I go on about pawn structure. I always like having more space. So I would take white, but after the pieces come off, so if there was an exchange of a lot of pieces, then black's pawn structure would start to tell more and more. So white doesn't usually want to exchange too much off, only exchange what benefits him or her. And again, each side is using a square to as a base of operations for their pieces. So again, white still has d4, black has c5. And I think here the position is fairly even. So those are some options if you choose to play the French. Again, if you want to have a closer look at some of the lines I've mentioned here, leave a comment below and I might do a video exploring it in more detail. So, comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.